English humour, a swing and a swoop through the great gig, which is English language humour. Part 18, from jazz to rock and roll. Over the pond, America was stealing a march on us comedically and satirically. The development of the stand-up circuit was throwing up geniuses, both there and in the Just for Laughs Festival of Montreal in Canada. Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles were all becoming hotbeds of comedy. And I'd like to make a bridge from the 50s to the 90s now by looking at three groundbreaking comedians of that place and time. Leonard Alfred Schneider was born in 1925 and died in 1966, with his trousers down and a syringe in his hand. He was possibly the first comedian that dared to address certain issues head on. A man who didn't fear the censors or the authorities. He spoke about sex, including an excellent satire of the sex act, where a drum provides the sound effects, or drugs. "I am the Louis Pasteur of junkiedom," he said. Politics, religion. If Jesus had died in the 20th century, all his followers would have little electric chairs hanging round their necks. He started in the San Fernando Valley strip clubs, finding his style, looking around. Well, this led to quite a few arrests on charges of drugs and obscenity. On one occasion, a young man accompanied him to the police precinct and was also arrested for not giving his ID. I can give his ID. His name was George Carlin. And Leonard Alfred Schneider is, of course, better known to us today by his stage name Lenny Bruce. He was arrested 8 times in total. The first time in the Jazz Workshop, San Francisco, 1961, where he was happily using the words cocksucker and cum, as he always did, but this time found himself arrested and put on a charge of obscenity. Subsequently, plainclothes policemen would turn up at his gigs and pretend to be audience members, waiting for one of those words to be said. One anecdote says that the police entered his hotel room in New York when he was sprawled on the bed, stoned. A policeman found some white powder in one of the drawers and asked Lenny Bruce what it was. "Aspirin," he said. "Aha, and this?" said the policeman, producing a syringe. "I can't stand the taste," he replied. His last ever gig was at the Fillmore East with Frank Zappa's group. Zappa was also a defender of free speech and against the obscenity laws. He himself was taken to court, where the judge said, "You have young children, Mr. Zappa. Don't you believe in any kind of censorship?" To which Mr. Zappa replied, "Of course. I always tell my children that if they see a guy in a brown suit on the television with a telephone number at the bottom, they should turn off." This is about comedy, not music, but here's another Zappa quote that I like. Speaking of rock music journalists, people who can't write, writing about people who can't play, for people who can't read. Like Elvis Presley, Mr. Bruce died sitting on the toilet with his pants round his ankles. But a friend had pulled the pants back up by the time the police arrived, but they weren't happy with the photo op, so they pulled his trousers back down, put him back on the toilet seat in a nice visible position, and even fetched a box of syringes from one of the cupboards. Lenny Bruce's stage style was referred to as jazz music, as he liked to improvise, and as subsequent comedians called it, he liked to riff on a theme. So it's often said that Lenny Bruce brought comedy into the jazz age. Our next comedian was also a heavy drug user. In fact, the thing that people most know about him is that he set himself on fire while freebasing cocaine. Well, Richard Pryor did like to freebase cocaine, as he readily admitted, but that wasn't the true story. Perhaps we should start with Richard Pryor's early life. His father was a violent pimp. He was brought up in a brothel, largely by the owner. his own grandmother, and started out as a comedian to earn some bucks. The legend, as he tells it, was that he was doing Las Vegas one night when he saw Dean Martin in the crowd. Now, Dean Martin, one of the famous Rat Pack, an anti-authority figure, a keen drinker, a rabble-rouser, well, his presence in the crowd made Pryor question what he was doing, and he switched from the clean-cut stuff to the more risque sex and drug routines that made him famous. Watch films of his stand-up now and you'll find them littered with bitch, nigger, freebasing, and a panoply of outrageous words. So the real story of him burning himself was that he'd actually tried to kill himself, inspired by a Vietnamese monk who'd set himself alight in 1963 as an act of protest against the war. Well, you can see we're kind of on an extreme edge here with these guys. Richard Pryor busting through the walls, paving the way for future performers like Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, and the third of my representative trio, Bill Hicks. Drugs and censorship continue to be part of the story here. Bill was born in 1961. His father was a pastor, so a lot of his onstage style has been taken from this. From an early age, he started doing impressions of the preacher, not just his father, but the televangelists that were so prevalent in 60s America. When he was 13, he was doing comedy, sneaking off to try to appear in clubs downtown, and by the time he was 17, his parents were taking him to a psychoanalyst. At the end of the first and only session, the psychoanalyst took Bill to one side and said, "You can continue coming if you want to, but it's them, not you." Bill was a great fan of drugs, even after he'd left them behind. "Don't like drugs?" he asked the audience. "Well, you can throw your record collection out of the window." However, in 1988 he decided he wasn't going to take any more drugs, and that included alcohol, but it didn't include the tobacco that hastened his end, aged 32, in February of 1994. Frank Zappa, who we mentioned earlier, was very much an anti-drug campaigner, but also died early, in his 50s, thanks to excess caffeine and nicotine, which don't seem to count as drugs. Anyway, Bill was doing well. He was getting on in America. He'd made appearances on the Letterman show, which was big news. The first time he went on there, he sauntered over to the guest's chair, slumped on it as if he was at home, and took out a packet of cigarettes and began to smoke, which of course you couldn't do. But he really loved smoking. One of the nice routines he had was to ask the audience, "Any smokers here?" A timid cheer would go up.
You ready for this, smokers? Listen to this. How many non-smokers do we have here tonight? Non-smokers. What a bunch of whining maggots. Bunch of obnoxious, self-righteous slugs. Don't take that on. I'd quit smoking if I didn't think I'd become one of you, I swear to God. I'm willing to die 7 years before my time just so I'll be cool each last fucking day.
Later, though, on his 12th appearance on Letterman, his entire routine got pulled, as they thought it might attract criticism from the Christian right. This was the first time that a whole routine had been censored, and Bill Hicks was quite affected by it. "They're only jokes," he kept repeating. But the censored routine did get an airing in January of 2009. Bill, like nobody else, played with the emotions of the audience, sending us on drug-inspired fantasies, relating anecdotes from his own life, always with his special perspective of the truth seeker. He was a success in Just for Laughs in Canada, and more of a success in London, which is where he really made his name. "The English have a sense of irony that the Americans don't understand," he said. Such an influence did he have on British life in general that the 10th anniversary of his death was mentioned in the House of Commons, and a show ran at the Edinburgh Festival for several years, where comedians got up and tried to answer the question, What would Bill say? As we'd all love to know what his take on modern politics would be. What Would Bill Hicks Say is now a book, if anybody's interested in knowing what modern comedians think Bill would have said. In his later shows, he included a kind of reproduction of Terence McKenna's stoned ape theory, where consciousness evolves from the taking of psychedelic mushrooms. He would often begin his shows with loud rock music, a bit of fire and smoke, as his black-clad silhouetted figure appeared in a doorway. Where Lenny Bruce was jazz, Bill Hicks was definitely rock and roll. And after a side-splitting comedy show, would often finish with a more serious monologue, where he compared life to a ride in an amusement park.
The world is like a ride at an amusement park, and when you choose to go on it, you think it's real, because that's how powerful our minds are. And the ride goes up and down and round and round. It has thrills and chills, and it's very brightly colored, and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while. Some people have been on the ride for a long time, and they begin to question, is this real, or is this just a ride? And other people have remembered, and they come back to us, and they say, hey, don't worry, don't be afraid, ever, because this is just a ride, and we kill those people. But it doesn't matter, because it's just a ride. And we can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice. No effort, no work, no job, no savings of money. A choice right now between fear and love. Here's what we can do to change the world right now to a better ride. Take all that money we spend on weapons and defense each year and instead spend it feeding, clothing, and educating the poor of the world, which it would many times over, not one human being excluded, and we can explore space together, both inner and outer, forever in peace.
So not your ordinary comedian then. Something of the hippie, something of the poet, a lot of the individualist. And in essence, hauling the comedian up, finally, from being the least considered act on a variety bill to being the rock star. Well, the next segment is going to explore that, because we called the alternative comedy that Bill was a part of and was gathering massive success in the British Isles and other countries alternative comedy, otherwise known as the new rock and roll.